Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second joint committee meeting for this triennium. Firstly, I'm going to start with the Karakia. Would anyone like to do that this morning? I'm quite happy to. Okay. Whakataka te hau he te uru, whakataka he hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, he ake anu te atakura, he tio, I hoka, he hauhu, tai e mori ora. Right, next we'll move to apologies. I have apologies from Councillor Mahuta, Mayor Church, Councillor Williams, Susan Law and Langley Carvers. Do I have any others? There being none, can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Buckthorpe and Councillor Ngātaki. Next, item 3 was the introduction of our new KEG chair. Gareth Green has left us and moved to New Plymouth District Council as a CE, and Susan Law, who is the CE of South Waikato District, will be our new KEG chair. Unfortunately, Susan couldn't be with us today, so I'm just going to table agenda item number 3 for our next round because she would like to personally introduce herself. I'd just like to also note that we have Councillor Lee from South Waikato listening online. Number 4 is the confirmation of the agenda. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Councillor Brown. Seconded, Councillor Pike, thank you. Next, we'll move to disclosures of interest. Does anyone have any? Councillor Taki, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just putting in my conflict of interest around, I was sitting on the panel there that's been discussed here for the controller job.
Right, okay, thank you very much for that. Any others? There being none, can I have do I have to move in second? Disclosures of interest? Good. Next, we move to confirmation of the minutes from last time. Before I ask for a mover and a seconder, is there any points of clarification or comment? There being none, can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Grant, was that a hand up? Yep. And Councillor Goddard, thank you very much. Next, we move to iwi and Māori strategic priorities proposal. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of this report is to give you as a committee an opportunity to consider a proposal to co-design with local iwi a group-wide strategic work programme, and also to consider a proposal for providing oversight and governance of that work programme, that co-designed work programme. So our current group plan requires community participation, and it specifically includes iwi in a number of activities such as community engagement, planning, and lost my place. Yep, so my apologies there. So the group plan, which is our 5-year strategic document, legal document, requires community participation, including iwi, in community planning, community engagement, operational planning, and other CDEM related activities. The group plan also identifies that there is an absence of any oversight of those individual council activities around community engagement and planning that involves iwi. The group plan basically puts the onus on each of the council members, each of the group members, puts the onus on them to have relationship with iwi and undertake work, including emergency management, as each council sees fit, in essence. So this proposal is to, if approved, would see the joint committee, sorry, the KEG, with local iwi chief executives design a strategic work program that sits outside the group plan and that achieves the strategic priorities of both parties, if you want. And then there would be an opportunity to invite iwi chairs to sit at the joint committee to provide oversight of the delivery of that work program. Now, the benefits of that are, we don't know what's coming down the track in terms of legislation, in terms of the specifics, but we do know that the legislation is likely to tell us that that iwi need to be engaged. And other than delivering the strategic work program, which is the prima facie reason for this, it will also give us an opportunity to try and feel our way of what works for the Waikato in terms of representation of Māori around the civil defence, governance, executive and other tables. Because I suspect the legislation will tell us in the future that it's up to us to resolve, it will mandate representation, but it's up to us as a group to try and resolve how that representation looks like. So it actually starts that representation ball rolling a lot earlier. You as a joint committee have previously resolved to engage with iwi and have seats around the table. So there's nothing that's in conflict with previous directions of the joint committee. One issue one point I want to highlight in the report is I talk about at point 11 the co-opting of iwi chairs from the Tainui Waka Alliance. That's my error. It's been pointed out to me that what I thought was the Tainui Waka Alliance is probably narrower than where I was thinking. It's the iwi chairs, which would be the iwi chair from Waikato Tainui, Raukawa, Maniapoto Hauraki, and Ngāti Tuwharetoa. So that's an error on my part in terms of the understanding of the Waka Alliance, but it is the iwi chairs from the Waikato region.
Thank you, Julian. I believe Councillor Mahuta had a point about the iwi chairs being able to appoint an alternate. Do you want to speak? I don't want to speak for her, but I just wondered if you wanted to mention that.
So I had a meeting with Councillor Mahuta last week to talk about this particular item or other stuff, but this particular item we had quite a bit of conversation around, and she is supportive of the item, and I know she's passed that through Councillor Downard. But the one thing she wanted to highlight in the conversation was that iwi chairs may not be available for all meetings, and that there was some kind of flexibility built into the resolution that says it was iwi chairs or the iwi chairs governance delegates. Of course, just from a structural point of view, I think it probably needed to be very clear that was Councillor Mahuta's wording, was governance delegates. Bearing in mind we will be engaging at an executive level with the iwi chief executives at a KEG level, it probably wouldn't be appropriate then for those same delegates to come and sit at this table, because they'd be overseeing their own work in essence. But that was the request from Councillor Mahuta, was to consider that it's not as fixed as iwi chairs, but there is some flexibility in there that says it's iwi chairs or their governance delegates.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else? Yes, Councillor Brown.
Thank you, through the chair. Just a quick question to you, Julian. With these people, they're appointed onto our joint committee, as I understand it, on the staff recommendation that we're reading here. Do they can have input and everything, of course. Do they actually into voting rights as well?
So yeah, really good questions. So this is different to the previous. This advice that KEG have received and have accepted is different to previous discussions where we would have iwi chairs or their governance delegates appointed as members of the joint committee or co-opted onto the joint committee as, if you want, members of the joint committee. This is probably a step before that, and this is the co-opting of iwi chairs or the governance delegates onto joint committee for the purpose of oversight and governance of the work program and only the work program. So it's a first step, if you want, because there's probably a whole load of fish hooks in there. But one point I would like to highlight is, at the moment, the legislation, in terms of, if you look at it from a partnership point of view, the legislation doesn't provide for equal partnership or true partnership, because it would still be an invite from a committee of governors to iwi to sit at their table. So whereas the legislation is likely to change in the next 12 months or so, that would actually, an invite is not required. It's actually mandated in legislation. So there is a true partnership at that point. So this actually seems to be a very good first step, especially when you consider that our group plan that's currently under review is going to be delayed. It's going to be delayed, as has been reported to you previously, because we have to wait for the new legislation to come through, then we have to wait for the national plan to come through, and then we have to be consistent with both of those. So we can't review our group plan until then. That could mean that we are probably 18 months or even more down the track until we get our new strategic 5-year plan. And there is, I think I've highlighted to you at the beginning, or tried to, until I got lost off my page, that there is no collective agreed strategic plan in our 5-year strategy that involves iwi. It is all at the local level, and there is no coordination of that, or little coordination of that, at a regional level to ensure that what's happening in Hauraki is what's happening in Tuwharetoa and what's happening in Raukawa, for example. So that consistent approach to, or coordinated approach to a strategic work program that's been agreed by the iwi themselves. But you have, in terms of legislative or process-wise, you as a committee have agreed to or resolved to allow the co-opting of members onto the committee. So all that groundwork's been done for you.
Councillor Buckthorpe.
Thank you, through the chair. Julian, yeah, I agree. It looks like a good step forward and something that needs to happen. We've been sitting on it for so long. Can you just clarify for me what you were talking about, the difference between having an alternate and governance delegates? Is there a difference?
I suppose the easiest one for me to describe is how we operate here. At this moment in time, there is a primary. So the legislation says it's the mayor, who is the member of the group, who is a joint committee member, but they can delegate it to another elected member. It can't be you as a Mayor Toby can't delegate to the chief executive to come to this table. They have to delegate to an elected member, and it's yourself, and it's the same around the table here. So I would say the governance member is, from an iwi perspective, is exactly the same. The iwi chair, if you just treat them as the mayor, and they can delegate that to somebody else who is on the governance table, which is different to the executive.
Would anyone else have any further comments? Councillor Dunnett.
Yeah, I'd just like to endorse what Councillor Mahuta's saying. It's a no-brainer. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that they need to be at the table, at the grassroots. You know, when you look at how many hapu are in our region, and come with those hapu is marae and the infrastructure that they've got, and a lot of them have been refurnished and done up. So yeah, they need to be at the table at some form and sense. And I think Councillor Mahuta, with the chairs, they are so busy, as all chairs are, and they want the ability to appoint an alternative.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? Okay, so what we'll need to do is part 3 of the recommendation is we just need to amend that. I'm just wondering, to sit on joint committee for the purpose of providing governance and oversight. Julian, will there be some sort of an agreement or terms of reference provided outlining that it is for oversight and advice at the table with the?
There will be we will draft terms of reference to fit exactly what it's, so everyone's clear on roles and responsibilities about going back to Councillor Brown's comments or question around, is there voting in other parts of the agenda? What we're saying here is, no, this is governance and oversight of strategic work programme once that's been designed.
Okay. I also, we need to do this properly from the outset, and so I'm just not quite sure what the appropriate way is to start the conversation, or that first hui, whether it's you invite them to us or do we go to them. We've just got to make sure that we set up the relationship from the start.
So we've got, at the moment, we've engaged a consultant who's got us to this point, and it's also been highlighted to me again in my conversation with Councillor Mahuta last week that we have Councillor Mahuta and Councillor Hodge, or you have Councillor Mahuta and Councillor Hodge from Waikato Regional Council who have been approved or been approved by yourselves to be advisors. So how we go about the next steps will be based on the advice that we get from the relevant parties. We certainly won't be putting our best foot forward in the wrong place, not intentionally anyway.
Okay, great. And Councillor Ngātaki, you might be able to provide some guidance as well around the right protocols and to start that process as well. Great, thank you. So I'll read the amended recommendation. So now, point 1 is that the report iwi Māori strategic priorities proposal be received, and 2, that the joint committee approve the proposal from the group via the KEG, engages with local iwi to design a strategic work plan that sits outside the current group plan, and 3, that the joint committee approve the proposal of the group proposal from the group. That doesn't sound quite right, does it? To invite the Waikato region iwi chairs or their governance delegates to sit on the joint committee for the purpose of providing governance and oversight of any agreed strategic work plan. Goodness me. So can
I'd like to move. Madam
Thank you,
Chair.
Councillor Downard. Can I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Councillor Brown. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Next we move on to item 8, which is the budget for operational readiness team fixed term role.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So just from the outset, for new members, this might be an interesting concept. The heading of this starts talking about operational roles, so it's asking for talking about the extension of a fixed term role, and you would wonder why that's coming to a joint committee, and the answer is we're actually asking you for use of the reserves. That's in the terms of reference for this group, that any use of unbudgeted reserves has to come through this group. So that's actually the purpose of the report, but we've given you the context to why we're asking to use it. So this is giving you an opportunity to consider the use of the unbudgeted reserve funds. These reserves are generated through the carry forward of annual underspend. So the civil defence budget is ring fenced, and it cannot be redistributed throughout the regional council. Who rate on your behalf, it's ring fenced and therefore carried forward in a reserve, and joint committee approval is required for the use of any of this reserve, irrespective of the fact it was rated and profiled in previous years. So the KEG have endorsed the proposal for an extension to an operational team member. It's a fixed term role by an additional 12 months, which would see it ending in August 2024. There is no budget allocated for that role, however, hence why I want to use the reserves and not go to an annual plan and ask for a rate increase, etc. The reason that we're asking for the extension is we have had a lower than projected completion of operational readiness team activities. This has been directly attributed to by emergency responses throughout the life of the group plan. So whether that was prior to COVID, there were some floods down in Southland and Westland, then there were COVID, and we've got the current event going on, and we've had abstractions, etc. So the operational readiness team priorities have had a lower than expected completion rate, and the current level of FTE in the operational readiness team will not be sufficient to deliver core functions and play catch up with what we haven't yet delivered. The overall cost for the extension of the role is $113. That's $113,000 for that extra 12 months. If the committee decides that it doesn't want to use or doesn't want to approve the use of the reserve, then the other option that we would have then is to reprioritize the work program and just work out what we can achieve in the next 12 months before the next annual plan, sorry, or long-term plan. So that's the request from myself to you. It's for the use of $113,000 of reserve funds. The background there is it's for an extension of a fixed term.
Councillor Dannard.
So through you, Madam Chair. So Julian, that reserve fund, does that use it, lose it, or it doesn't? So it just builds up. So how long is that the reserve fund built up to this? How long has it taken?
Off the top, I can give you a rough, without looking at the details, it's probably from there about 3 years.
Okay, and what else? Have you used it for anything else? Like, is this going to compromise anything else that it might use for?
No, the last time it was used was actually to, the last time it was approved was to pay for the fixed term role that's there. So that was then it was used for some of the COVID operational costs that were unbudgeted, that we couldn't reclaim back from central government. So it was used for some of that, and then the majority of it was used to pay for the current fixed term, which was for 2 years. But what's happened in that 2 years is, whilst we've had a fixed term person come into the operational readiness team, we've had other people leave and vacancies linger, and then other operational deployments, which meant that actually we've not even been treading water, even with the fixed term role.
Councillor Buckthorpe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Julian, just a question. What actually is our balance in our reserves fund at the moment? To me, this is a no-brainer. And the other point that I was going to ask was, are there any plans to have this role moved to a full-time equivalent position? Yeah. Because we need that.
So on last check, again, don't hold me to the absolute dollar, but it's in the region of $299,000 is in the reserve fund. Give or take, it's in that ballpark. And in terms of the going forward and if you're full time, then we've got an opportunity to consider that at the next LTP, which is coming up this year. But at the moment, this is very much separating the looking forward and dealing with the looking backwards, and that's what we're concentrating on, is the looking backwards and what haven't we achieved, what do we need to, or what would we ideally like to achieve in the next 12 months. And then we'll go away and have a look at, and I think there is a line in my report somewhere that does talk about the forecasted increased demands that are going to come from central government, and that is where we would start to look at any future increase to establishment. Because you're right, there's absolutely an increase in operational work being flagged, and our current team is not, our current establishment is not designed with that in mind. So we will have to look at the options of how we cut our cloth to deal with that going forward.
Yeah, that's good, because it's an important role, and to attract the right person to it, we need to have some security of job tenure there. So to have a fixed term role, it's not ideal.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, through the chair. I'm very, very along with Councillor Buckthorpe's thoughts. I just wanted to question, it is only for 1 year, but you're telling us that it will be put into the LTP for, extending this into the future. Because I think that this is a very important role, and it's something that we're going to have in a permanent feature, virtually, our operational expenses.
Neville, can I just ask a question of, is it usual in the terms of reference to have operational positions come to governance?
This question was, given that we're accessing funds that I think given that we're accessing funds that sit in the reserve, they're dedicated for the purposes of civil defence management, and my understanding is it is a decision of this committee to access and allocate those funds for whatever purpose, and in this particular case, it happens to be for an operational position.
Sure. Any further questions or points? There being none, the recommendation is that the report budget for operational readiness team fixed term role be received, and that the joint committee approve unbudgeted reserve funds of $113,000 be allocated to fund salary and overhead costs for an extension of an operational readiness team fixed term role. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that, please? Councillor Goddard, and seconded Councillor Buckthorpe. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, item 9, disaster relief funds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is very much about providing visibility and information on the recent central government contribution of disaster relief funding, or a lot of you will know it as mayoral relief funds, to support those in the Waikato CDM group area, those councils that were affected by Cyclone Gabriel. So the Minister for Emergency Management announced the government provided a contribution to this CDM group area of $500,000. The fund was allocated to the CDM group. That's you, and the group was given responsibility for that. Now that's the reason I'm highlighting this. A lot of times the government will give the money directly to local authorities and deal directly with mayors, and that's why it's called a mayoral relief fund. But because this was money that was needed to get out quickly and across a number of council areas, it was allocated to the civil defence group. The letter that came with the money notably identified the Waikato district, Thames Coromandel, Matamata-Piako and Hauraki districts. They were the councils named in the letter, and the purpose of the fund was to provide rapid relief. So an extraordinary KEG meeting was held on the 2nd of March to understand how we were going to allocate that $500,000, and KEG agreed an allocation structure across those 4 councils named in the letter. And there were a number of data sets we could have looked at. Could have looked at rural sector, could have looked at amount of roads that were being impacted, could have looked at an amount of coastal erosion there had been, but the one, if you want, constant data set that cut across all councils was houses that were stickered, and that was stickered at a red level, yellow level, or a white level. So that was used as the, if you want, consistent benchmark. That doesn't mean to say that the money could only go to people with impacted housing. It was just used as a data set for allocation of costs based on percentage of houses stickered overall. What that resulted in is, as you can see at point 9, every council got $50,000. That was the starting point. And then the other 300,000, that's each of the 4 councils, every council got 50,000, and the remaining 300,000 was divided by percentage of the houses stickered, which meant that Waikato District Council got an overall apportionment of $190,000. Thames Coromandel Council got $184,000. Hauraki got $76,000, and Matamata-Piako got $50,000. The Matamata-Piako Council have asked the regional council to retain that $50,000 on their behalf at this moment, whilst they undertake more work to understand if there is a need for it. And if no need is identified, then that $50,000 will be redistributed across the other councils based on the same apportionment criteria. I know I've had a conversation with Mayor Toby from Hauraki, and there are some conversations going on around whether or not all of the $76,000 that Hauraki have been allocated will be needed, and whether or not that will need to be sent back to us at the group for redistribution. But that's work ongoing by those two respective councils, Marabarapiako and Hauraki. What's interesting around that is any money not used within 6 months will likely have to be sent back to central government. So it's really important that those two councils undertake that work, and so we can get any foreseeable underspend redistributed to the communities that need it. And again, there is a role for each of the councils that are spending that money need to report through the civil defence group back to central government to show that the money's being used for what it should have been. And it can't be used for council costs. You know, it's all about community, and a criteria has got to be established, and each of the councils were provided with that guidance. So at the next joint round of advisory group, executive group and joint committee, we will be asking those councils who have received money to report back on what priorities they set, what processes they established to allocate that money, and how that money's been distributed. Because that is an onus on you as a civil defence group to provide oversight for and reassure central government, because they will ask for an overall report, reassure that we've been spending the money as we were asked to.
Councillor Lee.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Julian, through the chair, but Julian, with the thousands of dollars that were raised throughout the communities within New Zealand, I was just wondering, is any of that money coming back to some of those areas that within the Waikato that we that need that money, or is it just going to government organisations?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Lee. So I can't speak for the money that was raised. So any money that was raised and externally to the Civil Defence Group and would have been sent to, whether it was the Red Cross, they would have allocated that to councils that had mayoral relief funds established. I'll use the Red Cross as an example, but the Red Cross will only send money to a council that had mayoral relief funds established. They wouldn't send it to a council that had nothing set up. And each of those mayoral relief funds will have had their own criteria and their own priorities, but mayoral relief funds must be community focused. They're certainly not organisational spend. There cannot be organisational spend. In terms of this money, the disaster relief fund, in essence, it's the government contribution to those mayoral relief funds. So again, it can't be used for government or local government spend for any of our operational costs or any of our staffing costs or any of our repair issues. It has to be focused on community, if you want, community priorities, but those priorities are different from council to council. I would imagine if you went over to Thames Coromandel, and I've got a little bit of knowledge here, this contribution, the 184,000 from central government, will be added to the mayoral relief fund there that has lots of other money. There was money from probably Red Cross and other organisations that contributed to that mayoral relief fund, so that the fund will be a lot bigger in Thames. But I know that Thames have a focus, or had a focus, on the local economy and some of the small businesses. Whereas if you go over to Waikato District again has a mayoral relief fund, but there's probably less emphasis on small businesses and more emphasis on houses and impacted households, and that's where their priorities would be. So that's where the money's got to go, and that's the reporting that's required, Councillor Lee, is to ensure that the councils haven't been spending it on things that are not listed in the rules.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments?
Just through the chair, Julian, was there any terms of reference handed down from the government regarding the use of that money for communities versus the rural sector? Are they separated, or can they overlap?
So no, there was no, the government didn't give any terms of reference. It was for the impacted communities, generic. And there is a guidance that comes with that. There is some specific central government guidance that outlines in high level terms what it can be used for and what it can't be used for. But it didn't stipulate that this must be used for rural communities, or it must be used for, if you want, social or cultural issues, or small businesses. It just lists what it can be used for. Rural's in there, towns are in there, people's household goods and services, people who have lost everything are in there, removing debris or silt on people's land is in there. So it really is what you as a council not want to spend it on. You as a council have deemed are your local priorities, and it will differ from council to council. But you've got to put a application process in place as well. So it's not cost neutral to the council. There will be a cost to it. The council and the mayor sets the priorities based on what you know the impacts are, and then you have to set up an application process and reach out. Whether it's a rural community, you reach out to your rural community and say, we have a sum of money available, and if you want to apply for it, this is how you do it.
I just wonder, under the guise of this agenda item, if any of the 4 worst affected councils that we're talking about in this, with this money allocated, if there's any feedback or comments you'd like to make about your experience. Councillor Grant.
Thank you very much, through the chair. On behalf of Thames Coromandel District Council, the fund has been something which is absolutely critical to what we're doing. We've put a criteria out and received a number of applications that have come in from across a number of sectors through both individuals, as Julian has described, who have been impacted by the events, through to businesses as well. So we're well aware and have had great support outside of this fund from larger business corporations that have contributed to the Mural Fund as well. So it has been extremely helpful, and at this stage appears to be well oversubscribed in regard to the applications that have come in. But it's been integral to what we've needed as part of our recovery program.
Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you. Through the chair, the 50,000 that we haven't received because we've asked you to sit on it, would you be expecting the first 50,000 that we did get to be returned if it wasn't used, or is that to be kept as such?
No, it's the 50,000 was the baseline that we gave to all 4 councils when we looked at when Māori then returned its if you want stickered housing. You didn't have any stickered housing. You had some houses impacted, but they didn't need to be stickered, so you fell outside that criteria. So what will happen now is we've been told to hold on to the 50,000, so there's more work going on at a local level to understand, are there any impacted communities that are sticking their hand up late that people were unaware of, because these things happen, and if there are, then you will have to establish a process for that, a mayoral fund and a process for application. Certainly the indications we're getting at the moment from certainly from your executive are that it is likely this fund will be returned to the group for redistribution amongst the other 3 councils, because there is the initial work going on is demonstrating there probably isn't a need or a demand for it in the Mātamata council area. We wouldn't be able to hold on to it because if it's not spent within 6 months, we, the group, has to return it to. We have to return any unspent money to central government.
Councillor Nautaki.
Morena. The same with us in Waikato District. So we've been very appreciative of the funds that's been allocated to us. We had a good process that was set up for our communities, and we know we work through with a lot of communities, part of the communities as well, on how to apply for it, because it seemed, it was actually quite straightforward, but they just weren't sure. And then they were very modest around actually applying for it. Maybe it shouldn't be for them, but in actual fact it was. We still have some families, some whānau that are still awaiting their insurance claims and things like that. So we've also put up a process as well, part there of the Merrill Fund, so that can also come back to us later around that as well. So it's been very valuable for us in the Waikato. It's still ongoing for us out there. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Councillor Buckthorpe, do you have any comment for Hauraki?
Yeah, I need to talk with Toby. I have talked with Langley, but I wasn't aware that Toby was considering returning it. I think Councillor Ngātaki's made some really good comments, and that there are a lot of people out there that are very humble about applying for funds. And I guess from my own perspective, we've been significantly affected ourselves by this event. It basically took 2/3 of our fencing infrastructure out on our farming operations. So, and I guess I'm a bit compromised talking about this fund, but I'll talk to Toby about that. But I think we need to do a bit more work at Hauraki level and get this application out there for the community and say people that have applied for, you commented about insurance. I don't think that those people should not apply because they have insurance, because insurance basically doesn't cover most costs anyway. And just because they've got the insurance doesn't mean they shouldn't apply for it. I don't believe. I think it should be a level playing field. And the money's there, so there's people out there that we need to reach out and make sure that they're aware that it is there and they need to put their hand up.
Thank you. Are there any other comments from any other districts? Julian?
Would it be a good opportunity just to update? I know it's not an agenda item, but it's specific to Gabriel, just to give literally 2-minute update on where the recovery is at and where we are as a region. Members be interested?
I think this is a great opportunity while we're all together to have a discussion about it. So I'm happy if there's a consensus around the table. Yes.
Okay. So it is a brief one. So we are still under so the state of national emergency expired and was cancelled, and we went into a transition notice or transition period, and we're still under a national transition period. So that means that civil defence legally, and you, the civil defence group, are legally, we are under a civil defence led recovery across the region. Now, that's really interesting when you consider that you've got quite distinct recovery going on. If you have a look at Waikato district versus if you want, the two biggest council areas that have been impacted, which is Thames Coromandel, Waikato district, they've got two distinct recovery approaches. This is just my terminology, but you've got Thames Coromandel is very much around the infrastructure. It's very much around the state highways and the roading, and if they can get the roading fixed, then that will drive the economy, and then the economy will drive the other aspects. So they have been very clear in their recovery, local recovery needs, that the infrastructure and the economy and the tourism is huge, whereas it's more of a people and place in Waikato district. And there's some coastal erosion and there's some local roads, but it's very much around red stickered houses and landslips threatening houses. And there's probably conversations going on at a council level around the future of some of those houses, for example. So the recovery is very different in those places. So to have a regional recovery plan would be quite difficult. Not unachievable, but actually what we've taken an approach here, we've created a regional recovery office. Irving Young, who is our team leader recovery and resilience, who sat in the back today. He is leading that regional recovery office. And the purpose of that regional recovery office is under the transition notice, under the central government transition notice, Irving and the team are mapping all the recovery that is going on across the region. And it's not just local councils. So, and that's the really important thing here. People are now, Taupo, for example, Taupo as a council will say that it is not in a recovery phase. Hauraki as a council will say that it's not formally got a recovery plan. This is business as usual. But we know there are organizations and community groups who are in recovery in those areas. So, for example, you've already heard Councillor Buckthorpe talk about the rural community being impacted. It might not be the council that's impacted, but there are rural community members who are in recovery in the Hauraki, and there are funds available at a national level through MPI and Rural Support Trust, etc., to support that. So we're mapping that. Oh, down in Taupo, you've got the forestry, and you've got the that has been impacted, and you've also got the Lifeline utility line, the lines company, which was significantly impacted, and a number of their infrastructure was impacted by the felling of forestry. Now, they're two examples, but you can see from that, just because a council has not got a recovery plan, because the council hasn't got recovery going on, it doesn't mean that there's not recovery going on within their district. So one of Irving's key roles, or the recovery team's key roles, is to map all that recovery, map all that central government funding, and where there are gaps identified and connections that need to be made, then that's the role of the regional recovery office, is to bring those organisations together, point them in the direction of the funding, or knock on the door of the council to say, you think you're not in recovery, but actually you've got groups in your area that are, and you need to connect with them. So it's joining the dots, making sure no one falls through the gaps, identifying any overlap and interdependencies. And only then, what we will do then is create either what's called recovery plans. So I've already talked to you, or not, we won't. We will assist those groups or councils to have recovery plans. So I've already talked to you about Waikato District and TCDC. They've got very clear recovery plans. But it may well be that there are a number of groups that come together that need to have a conjoined plan, local recovery plan or a locality plan if it cuts across agency borders, and understanding who is going to be leading that and what support they require. So it very much is a mapping and an introduction and a connection. Under the national transition period, there is powers to coordinate. There is, as the group recovery manager, your group recovery manager, I can start to direct if required, but I'm not anticipating or coordinate. I'm not anticipating any need to do that at the moment. It very much is the mapping and the introductions. Now, some of the complicators, and I say complicators in a nice way, just in terms of to your awareness, we as a civil defence group are 11 councils, which includes Coromandel and Waikato District, but at a national recovery level, so we're all in one civil defence group, but at a national recovery level, the cabinet allocated lead roles for ministers in recovery. So the lead recovery minister is Minister Robertson, and he allocated lead roles or lead ministerial roles for other cabinet members. And what we've got in the Thames Coromandel area is Minister Michael Wood is the lead minister for Coromandel and Auckland. In the Waikato district, or the Waikato as a whole, the minister is Minister Mahuta. Now, there is a little bit of a complicator there because Thames Coromandel is in our civil defence group area, but their lead minister is also operating out of Auckland. So we can work with that. We know about it, and it's just making sure that we're connected to the right groups and people, so we've got some visibility on what's going on, and that connection can be made, and any coordination that's required can be undertaken. The national transition period is 90 days initially. When that finishes, whether it gets extended, I'm not sure. But what's happening is it's transitioning away, the recovery is transitioning away from CDEM at NEMA level, at a national level, to what's called a cyclone recovery unit, which is being led by a lady called Katrina Casey. So that is where the central government will have, if you want, its provide leadership around recovery. Now, there's some complicators here, in that we've got very local recovery that's going on, but you've also got central government, a central government recovery unit that is going to be asking for some kind of reporting and some kind of visibility and transparency about what the local recovery plans look like, and interestingly, how those recovery plans are progressing. So we could end up in a situation that if we're not aware of it and we don't manage it well, that we could end up with a blurred lines of responsibility, because local recovery is the responsibility of the local councils. But what's been made very clearly is the recovery minister and cabinet want to ensure that they have central government staff and officers involved in your local recovery engagement with communities, because they want to hear what the communities want and need, and they want to be able to support local government to deliver that. So as long as and part of the recovery office role is just to monitor some of this and understand where some of the pinch points may occur, and to ensure that we always remember this is local recovery that's been regionally supported or coordinated and nationally assisted at some way, and it doesn't become a nationally led recovery, if that's what because it's local people will speak with Christchurch showed us this. The report, the review of Christchurch earthquakes, or the Canterbury earthquakes 2010, showed that central government role was huge and valuable in that initial response to major infrastructure failure, getting the infrastructure back up and going so people could remain in place. But what the communities look like going forward, what their towns and their cities and their social environment, cultural environment look like going forward, was absolutely best dealt with at a local level, and local councils know local communities. So that's a big part of the recovery office.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? Councillor Jeffries.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Morning.
Firstly, can I offer my apologies for my late attendance? They say you should never assume, and I assumed that it was the Hamilton City, and they didn't know anything about it, rightfully, so they sent me off to Genesis, and then I went back to Hamilton City in a bit of a grumpy mood, and they looked at my agenda and said, "Oh no, you need 160 Ward Street." So here I am. Sorry, so 20 minutes late. Yes, I just picking up on a point that was made there about local councils being responsible for local recovery. One of the issues that that surfaced recently for us, and I live in Karakia, is that the local emergency response plan is not known. The public education side of it is, and I'm not trying to be awful here, but there seems to be a lack of public education in terms of making the locals aware of just simple things like where your assembly points are, who's responsible for what, who does what, when they do it, those sorts of things. And I'll give you an example. One of our assembly points in Karakia was our local sports club. It burnt down last July, and I don't know where else. As far as I'm aware, there's been nothing else identified since then. Now, I appreciate I'm talking at a very local level here. So I think probably from our perspective, from a local perspective, I think it would be useful to have at least one session a year where perhaps a public meeting is held in the different areas where people are invited along, and you can run a day where people become familiar perhaps with those emergency response plans. So I'm sorry if I'm a little bit off the track there, but that's just how I sort of interpreted what you were saying before. So thank you.
Julian.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Jeffries. Certainly, we will have, it's separate to the recovery, because the recovery might go on for some time, and the recovery conversations probably will overlook the likes of Otrahonga, but wasn't significantly impacted, for example. But you'll be pleased to know that we are going to do an after-action report, after-action review. So that's already been triggered. It's going to be an independent one about how we responded and what we can learn, and that will tell us about how we were prepared. So that input becomes hugely important at that point. So you're not off track. It's absolutely, it will form part of our after action report, which will be done probably around May, and that will allow us to look at things, options to improve how we do things next time at the local and the regional level. But certainly what we'll do from here, and I'm looking over to my public education team over there, is we can't wait for May, because disasters don't wait for the next round of after action reports. We'll contact the local emergency managers over there to understand what's going on in Karakia and what communication needs to be put out in terms of people knowing where to go if the primary site has already gone from a fire. So we'll reach out and resolve that issue in the short term.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kit. Excellent. Sorry, I should call you. Councillor Jet, good morning. As I just wanted to relate to everyone, of course, we operate in civil defence, coordinate with Otrahonga and Waitomo. I've just taken a note of that, and as I say, I think if the education team could be saying, I do realise you've lost your main area with the sports club being burnt down, and that was an assembly point. But I think this is something we can address at a local level, along with assistance from you, Julian, and your team. And I think we can do this quite successfully. It's an unfortunate situation where you've got a lot of rural communities like yourself, okay, that are quite isolated when we have a significant civil defence act, something like rainfall or roads knocked out, as there were. And I think that we can work on that. So leave it at that.
Thank you. And I'm happy to chat to you offline about what some of the initiatives we have in Taupo that may help as well. But you have a lot of support around the table for that. And that, is there any further comments on this agenda item? There being none, the recommendation is that the report Disaster Relief Fund be received. Can I have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Brown. Thank you, Councillor Smith. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, move on to item 10, which is the summary of the KEG meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't, unless you've got particular questions, I don't intend to go into huge detail on this one. There is a summary of the KEG items that were discussed. Many of those items, including the group work plan, achieving iwi Māori strategic priorities, and the operational fixed term, have been brought here to this meeting. There are a couple of items I've referred that were discussed at KEG, the after action report. So that's been triggered. I've mentioned that. So we're going externally for that. And also there was one item there, which is the group recovery capability assessment. And that was discussed, and that basically there's a recommendation on there that we engage Mana Whenua in the recovery structures. So there's just some work going on in the background before we achieve that recommendation, because we have to engage with the relevant groups.
Thank you. Neville, do you have anything to add?
I think Julian's covered it all fine. And just for your information, the only reason I'm sitting in this seat today is because Susan, as you know, our recently appointed KEG chair, was unable to attend today, and Langley, I believe, is at the Merrill Forum. And so I'm sitting here keeping the seat warm just in case there's any curly questions that Julian can't answer, but he's doing a great job so far. Thank you.
Is there any comments or queries for those minutes? Okay, there being none, the recommendation is that the report summary of KEG meeting be received. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Naitaki and Councillor Downard. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, the next agenda item is the submission subgroup. I'll hand it over for any points to Julian, but I'd like to take the item as read, and just.
It's just there, Madam Chair, for audit and transparency purposes. None of this will have been a surprise. All the stuff was circulated via emails to you before the submissions went in, but this is just for process sake. All the submissions are listed for you and copies are attached.
Yep, and I'd like to thank Vicky and Jill for all their time online, getting these over the line. Councillor Pike.
I just wanted to pass on my thanks to the committee for forming this. I think it's vital that there is a civil defence lens across this bill. So want to thank the committee for their work on that.
Thank you. Any other comments or any queries? There being none, the recommendation is that the report submission subgroup submissions undertaken be received. Can I have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Buckthorpe. Seconder, Councillor Grant. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, item 12 is our group work plan.
So this is, again, myself, Madam Chair, this is to provide you with a high level assurance reporting on the status of our prioritised actions, both outside of the group plan from after action reviews and within the group plan. You can see that the majority have been completed or on track. There are 9 that are off track, but have overall plans, mitigation plans in place. So there was an item or a point at number 5 of this report that says that there were some of those off-track items. There were probably 3 of those off-track items that if we hadn't been able to approve or agree the iwi Māori strategic work program, they would have probably been hovering on going into red, because there were 3 particular items that we rely very heavily on input from iwi. So I'm glad to say there's nothing major to report there, because that will now keep us on track with mitigation in place. One thing I do want to point out is item 7 under the issues, and that is, we are, as I've already pointed out, we still are in an ongoing recovery, and the response to Cyclone Gabrielle continues to impact us, and the work plan. And just on the GMO alone, so our group office alone, not including your local staff who have all been, all of them to one way, shape or form, even those councils that weren't impacted, your emergency management staff have been involved, but the GMO alone have had in excess of 1,800 hours of response and recovery time that is unbudgeted, that has been taken away from BAU. So there will be some priority work program issues that will be impacted going forward again, and we'll report on those once we know. But this response, like other responses and recoveries, but this one in particular, will have an impact on the GMO-led stuff and the combined GMO and local stuff, which makes up the majority of the work program.
Any comments or queries for Julian? There being none, the recommendation is that the report, group work plan and COVID after action report prioritised goals be received. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that, please? Oh, sorry, Councillor Jeffries.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. There was just one, and I'm sorry if we missed the agenda item because of my lateness. I was just curious about the Tainui Waka advisory group. Does that cover the whole of the Waikato region?
So just to clarify that, we had a discussion about that, and it's not the alliance group. It is the Waikato region iwi leaders.
Right.
Which covers the 5 iwi across the Waikato.
Does that include Maniapoto?
Yes.
It does. Okay. And the coastal maraes and all those sorts of, they're all covered. Great. Thank you.
No problem. So can I have a mover and a seconder for, thank you, Councillor Goddard and Councillor Ngataki. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, we now move on to the local welfare manager appointments. Are you speaking to this, Irving or Julian?
I'll speak.
Okay.
So this is to provide you an update on local welfare manager appointments. There is a statutory, just a reminder, there is a statutory roles advisory and appointment committee that works for KEG, and they basically manage the policy settings that you've agreed. And in accordance with those policy settings, the 3 people named on this report have been identified, interviewed, and appointed as local welfare managers. There is actually it's not a statutory role in terms of legal powers that you as councils or you as the joint committee need to approve. But it's been pointed out in the past, and quite rightly, that the coordination of welfare services and the provision of rapid relief during an emergency is critical to a successful response and recovery. Without that welfare, or if that welfare is managed badly or ineffectively, then our response stands or falls on these individuals. So what we've identified was it's not a legal requirement for you to appoint these people. They've already been appointed. You did want to know about the appointment of these staff into roles, and all 3 of these have other day jobs within council, and it's worth pointing that out. And the feedback I've had from the group welfare manager and the committee members who interviewed was they all demonstrated strong leadership, and they demonstrated a potential to transfer the relationships that they have at a local level into the welfare role well. So we'll be well served by these 3 individuals. That's Claire Drummond from Taupo District Council, Mel Tarafati from Waikato District Council, and Debbie Lascelles for South Waikato District Council.
Thank you, Julian. This is quite just a technical item, really, not really. But is there any comments or queries? Great. So the recommendation is that the local welfare managers' appointments be received. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Brown and Councillor Downard. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, I'd now like to welcome, she's coming to us online, Catherine Duthie from Ministry of Primary Industries to give us a presentation on foot and mouth. This was actually a request from Mayor Church at the last meeting. So I'll hand it over to you, Catherine, and thank you for your time today.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'll just have to assume you're there because I can't see anybody on the screen except for your names. There's no video. So I'm here to give you a presentation around our foot and mouth disease preparedness, which has ramped up quite significantly in the last 6 months. So the presentation, and I'm not sure if any of you have seen this previously, it covers a little bit of the background of what the disease is, how it could get here, what we are doing to try and prevent that, and then a little bit about what a response could look like. So if at any stage you want to interrupt me and ask questions, that's absolutely fine. Please and I may not be able to see hands raised online or anything like that. So just chip in and ask those questions, and I will share my screen for the presentation. So please let me know when you can see that.
Yes, you're right, Catherine.
Fantastic, good stuff. Okay, so I'm the Group Manager of Readiness within Biosecurity New Zealand, and our mandate within Readiness is to be prepared for those threats that we have identified that are either likely or high impact. So we do a lot of preparedness work for things like fruit fly, for brown marmorated stink bug, for pine pitch canker, for all sorts of different things that could impact the primary sectors in New Zealand. Now, those things are likely to get here, or indeed have already. In the case of fruit fly, we expect a response every couple of years. But things like foot and mouth disease, it is a very low likelihood of getting to New Zealand. So I do want to emphasise that right off the bat. The likelihood is low. However, the impact is so enormous that it would be remiss of us not to do any readiness activities for this. So for that reason, it is a large focus of our work plan. So New Zealand has never had a case of foot and mouth disease. We have been free from foot and mouth disease. So we do need to understand that. I think some people think that we've had it in the past. We've had a couple of scares, but we have never had a case. And as I mentioned, it is very unlikely that it will arrive in New Zealand. So we have a range of measures right from our import health standards, which determine treatments that need to happen to certain risk items before they come into the country. There's a robust border system in place, and also surveillance and ongoing monitoring throughout the country to ensure that we don't have a case of foot and mouth disease. But we do take it very seriously, and particularly with the current Indonesian situation. So last year, foot and mouth disease was detected in Indonesia. They had been free for around 20 years. And because of Indonesia's proximity to Australia and the trade and travel that we have in Indonesia, we decided to take a really close look at our settings to ensure that we were still well protected. We also then decided to revamp our foot and mouth disease preparedness program and throw quite a number of people at it. We've had 70 people over the last 6 months to really make sure that our plans and processes are brought up to date. We're also working really closely with partners in the animal sectors across New Zealand through our government industry agreements and other connections that we have, plus also regionally to build resilience, modernise our approach, learn from the COVID-19 response, and I'm sure that that will have informed a lot of your work also. We're constantly looking at that to see how this thing might play out, but also our Mycoplasma bovis eradication program, which for those of you who are aware, it's a disease of cows that was throughout the country. That response has been ongoing in MPI since 2017. We can take a lot of lessons from that one also. So foot and mouth disease is the most significant threat we face. Now, it's a significant threat because if we were to have even a single case of FMD in New Zealand, our international trade in animal products would stop overnight. And as you can appreciate, that would cause huge economic impact to the country. It's a highly contagious viral disease, so very similar to COVID-19. It infects cloven-hoofed animals. So unlike Mycoplasma bovis, which infected only cows, this one is all cloven-hoofed animals. So things like cattle, pigs, deer, sheep, goats, alpaca, llamas, camels, and even things like giraffes. So it's a wide range of animals, which makes this likely to impact across a number of different high profile sectors. It can affect productivity. It's not a disease that's necessarily fatal to the animals, but it does have some pretty nasty symptoms, and it affects productivity. So the primary reason why this disease is a problem is because of the trade impacts of this disease. It's a disease that is managed in a number of different countries. It is not a food safety issue. So animals, even if they are infected, they are safe to eat for humans. But it does cause a drop in milk production for cattle and other milking animals. It doesn't have direct health effects on people, so people cannot catch foot and mouth disease from animals. However, the impacts of an outbreak, and particularly the measures that we would need to take to control an outbreak, would have serious psychological effects on the people that farm these animals. Now, it spreads really rapidly and can be spread by the breath, so close contact between animals, saliva, mucus can be spread through milk, feces, and on the wind in certain specific situations. So being a viral disease, it is highly contagious. So it does move rapidly between farms. Now, primarily this is helped by movement of animal and people, and any equipment and things like vehicles that are contaminated with maybe feces. It also can potentially spread, as I mentioned, by wind and water, although that is less likely to spread the disease. So in a global context, it actually exists in many parts of the world. So from the map that you see here, all the red countries are those countries where FMD is endemic. So they have it in their herds, they manage it or not, but it is present in those countries. The yellow countries, so a bit more north than all those red countries, is where it is sporadic. So outbreaks crop up from time to time in those areas, or it is sparsely spread in those areas. Now, there's places, particularly in South America, where they have multiple zones of FMD. So they either have it, or they are free from it, or they have it, but they control it through vaccination, or they are considered free because they vaccinate. There's a lot of different things going on in those South American countries. Now, you'll see all of the pale colours are those countries without FMD, and they constitute our major trading partners, our high-value markets, so North America and Australia. So a lot of our traders with those countries, and they would like to consider themselves free from FMD, and so therefore if we get it, the likelihood is it could potentially transfer to those free countries, which is why they would stop trade. So 77% of the global herd of susceptible animals do have FMD. That's a large number of animals worldwide. And as I mentioned, it is managed in a lot of those countries. And a lot of those countries still do have trade to other countries. They can export their animal products, but they do have conditions. So things like heat treatment and various other measures can reduce the risk of transmission. So they can still trade. However, that trade is of lower value than those countries who are free of FMD. Now, the little red circle there is Indonesia. So that was the most recent worldwide outbreak of FMD, and its physical proximity to Australia does increase the risk to Australia slightly. Now, also, we have looked at the increased risk in New Zealand and has determined that it doesn't increase the risk significantly to New Zealand. And this is because the likelihood of FMD getting to New Zealand is usually through personal consignments of meat or animal products that are bought by people into the country, not through commercial pathways. The commercial pathways are really well managed. So it is travellers bringing things into the country or people sending personal consignments, which is how it's likely to get here. But we have looked at our biosecurity settings and made some adjustments to really cover ourselves just in case. So I mentioned previously that even a single case would halt all trade in most animal products, and we would lose that FMD-free status overnight. So it may take up to 18 months to 2 years to regain that FMD-free status with the World Organization for Animal Health. And so that does have significant impact on the value of our trade. And of course, then we would have to renegotiate a lot of our trading relationships with other countries. There would be significant social costs because of the outbreak felt across the entire country. So not just from the loss of trade and the knock-on effects to industry, but the need to cull stock and quarantine farms would have massive impact on people. It would be a very costly response, and it would be an all of government response. So when you think about things like COVID, the Ministry of Health manage the spread of the actual disease, but then there's all sorts of other ministries that step in and manage various other bits of the response, and particularly when it comes to the welfare of people and providing financial support to those people who are impacted. So I mentioned previously the most likely route of entry is illegal importation of risk goods. So people bringing things across the border or sending things across the border that are not accompanied by an import health certificate. There's a couple of other steps that need to happen in order for an outbreak to occur in New Zealand. And each of these steps actually does decrease the risk even more. So just because something makes it across the border doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have an outbreak. So the most likely route of exposure is through this contaminated animal product fed to pigs. But the virus needs to be viable within that contaminated animal product, and it needs to be of sufficient quantity to create an infection in pigs. Pigs are really susceptible to contracting this virus through the oral route, so through eating contaminated product, more so than any other animal that is susceptible. So in that way, that is the best route of actually generating an outbreak in New Zealand. Now, pigs also manufacture much more virus within their bodies than any other animal as well, and they breathe out a lot of this virus. So if they are intensively housed, they can be highly infectious to any other cloven-hoofed animals nearby, and potentially up to several kilometres through this airborne spread. Now, you can imagine that if somebody has gone to all the trouble of bringing in food products into the country, their go-to is not actually to feed it to pigs. So even if that food product is contaminated with FMD, it is still unlikely to generate an incursion into New Zealand by being fed to pigs. But we do have rules around swill feeding to pigs. So any meat or food that has been in contact with untreated meat needs to be boiled for an hour to deactivate not just FMD, but anything else that might infect the pigs. And there's a current education campaign to reinforce these regulations. This is not just for commercial operators, but also for people with backyard pigs. So we're reaching out throughout our networks to try and enable people to understand these regulations. So in terms of an FMD outbreak, we have some disease management strategies. So what we want to do is rapidly detect this virus and delimit its spread. So that is key really to being on top of this sort of outbreak, is that ability to rapidly detect, rapidly stop the movement, so potentially fewer other locations will become infected. And then we'll aim to eradicate. Now, the World Organization for Animal Health, WOA, has some endorsed methods to eradicate in the shortest feasible time frame to enable us to return to trade as quickly as possible. So these methods are well documented, and we've been going through our operational specifications, updating all those methods and socialising those with various industry bodies. We also, throughout the outbreak, need to facilitate business continuity, make sure that we have domestic food security, and then the massive period of recovering. So recovering from any event, and we're all feeling that at the moment through the cyclone, can be a much longer period than the actual event itself. But minimising the wider socio-economic impacts is really critical to the success of any of these eradications. So in terms of our response strategy, the movement controls that we will put in place are key to preventing movement of this disease as soon as we detect it. So the first thing we would do is put in a national livestock movement standstill. So this means throughout the country, any livestock will stop moving. And susceptible animals have to stay on their current property. If they are in transit, so on the road already, and there's a couple of thousand animal movements every day within New Zealand, so this is going to be a major logistical exercise to ensure that all these stop. They can either carry on to their intended destination, or if their home destination is closer, then they return back to the point of origin. And there will be no Cook Strait movements during this time. Now, you can probably appreciate that this sort of transit and this sort of livestock standstill will cause quite significant animal welfare impacts throughout the time of the livestock standstill. So we're working to understand exactly what goes on throughout the country at the moment so that we can generate plans to minimise those animal welfare impacts. The next step, after we've stopped it, we've found out exactly where it is, we can shrink that area down to the infected area and have controls only on that area. So we're hoping the livestock standstill will go on for no more than 2 weeks. But of course, we have no real way of knowing how long that's going to go on until we're faced with the real situation. So stamping it out relies on determining the distribution and the scale of that outbreak. We will have designated risk areas and put movement controls on all sorts of things within those risk areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides' time. We will then cull all affected stock and go through a process of disposal, cleaning and disinfection of those farms. Now, the whole process of culling and cleaning and disinfection should only take probably 2 weeks on an individual farm. We aim to be in and out quickly to enable that property to return to trade. FMD is a disease that we can't waste any time because of its high transmissibility. So those of you who are familiar with bovis will know that we did allow some farmers who were determined to be infected, we allowed them to trade through so they could continue milking their herds, they could rear animals to a point where it was viable to take them to the works. That was because bovis is way less transmissible than FMD. And with controls in place, we could ensure that it stayed within the boundaries of that property. It's not the case with foot and mouth disease because of the viral transmission and the nature of the transmissibility. Now, there is also potential for vaccination of these animals. We do have stores of vaccines held offshore for this eventuality, and on notification of a response, we would activate our vaccine bank. This doesn't mean that we would automatically vaccinate those animals. If we vaccinate animals during an outbreak, that return to FMD freedom status takes a lot longer because while we're vaccinating, we're not considered to be free of foot and mouth disease. So it would be a decision that we would make at the time of an incursion, and it would really depend on the scale of the outbreak. If it was determined that it was quite widespread and the only way to stop further spread would be to vaccinate, we may well make that decision then. Now, the detection and the eradication of diseases like foot and mouth disease is actually the easy part. And with every incursion that we've had, the really hard part is minimising the impact on people, on the animals, and on the economy. So that has been a massive focus of planning for a response like this, is how do we do the job that we need to do, but minimise the impacts on the people. So this is just a little snapshot to show you why a national livestock standstill is so critical. So this is 1 week's worth of movements. So more than 200,000 animals that are NATE registered moved within this 1 week a couple of years ago. Now, NATE registered animals are only cattle and deer. So this doesn't take into account all the pigs and sheep and goats and other susceptible animals that could also be moving throughout the country. At this point, those animals are not required to be NATE registered. So we are working up systems to track movements of these other animals. But this is why, hopefully you'll understand that a national livestock standstill is critically important for controlling the movement. Now, in terms of zones in order to control further spread, once we have lifted the national livestock standstill and we've found out which areas have infected properties, I'm using this hypothetical situation to kind of give you a picture of the sorts of controls we would put in place. So there are 2 types of zones. There's surveillance zones, which are zones where we conduct intensive monitoring and surveillance and testing in order to determine where the infection is. And then there's control zones where we control movement of high-risk goods. So they're 2 quite different things, but the surveillance zones do inform the control zones. So on this day 1 scenario, we've detected a property in the Taranaki region that is infected with FMD. And so we put a couple of different zones around this property. Zone A is 3 kilometres out, Zone P is 10 kilometres, and Zone C is 50 kilometres. So this determines the surveillance activities that go on within this area. So Zone A, you'll appreciate, has much more intensive surveillance than Zone C, and we'll have people out on those properties sampling and testing individual animals. So because we've got Zone C here out to 50 kilometres, which has gone slightly beyond the boundary, the regional boundary of Taranaki region, and bumped over into the Manawatu-Whanganui region, both Taranaki and Manawatu are now high-risk areas. So these areas, we have very strict controls on moving things, and I'll get on to what exactly we would control in the next slide. But the rest of New Zealand is considered an at-risk area where the controls are far fewer. So on day 3, we've detected another couple of properties. That's the middle picture of this slide. which means that the 50k zone, that 50k surveillance zone around that area is slightly larger still and has just encroached into the Waikato region. So now the entirety of this Waikato region becomes a high-risk area. On day 7, you can see that we've found it further down, but because it's still within the Manawatu region, we don't extend the boundary out any further. So it's really difficult always to try and decide where these boundaries are and what regions we should lock down. You might think that the Waikato region is actually really quite a large region, but we've only encroached into a small part of it. But what we've learned from previous responses is that trying to draw boundaries, the best way and the most easy way for people to understand what's going on is by putting it at these regional council boundary areas. It's instead of trying to determine which, the boundaries end at which particular roads and whatnot. That just confuses the matter hugely. So the focus of movement controls is on controlling risk goods and susceptible animals and also germplasm, but not people. So we are not controlling the movement of people within these. It is only the things that are likely to move the virus further. So these high risk areas, so you remember the red areas from the map previously, we will have strict controls on susceptible animals, raw milk and germplasm, and these will not be able to be moved outside of these regions or even within the regions. Vehicles and equipment, things that have been in contact with these species or their byproducts, need cleaning and disinfecting before they can move off properties. So there will be a system of permitting in place to ensure the safe movement of things like this, but we do not prevent movement. They need to be done in a safe manner. Now, the at-risk areas, so all the yellowy areas in the map that I showed previously, goods other than susceptible animals and raw milk and germplasm carry far fewer restrictions, and we have a permitting system in place to allow other movements to take place. So the people who work on farm need to work very closely to follow any biosecurity requirements. I think the probably key message here is that this is actually a high trust model. And once we have moved past the national standstill, there are unlikely to be road closures or checkpoints or anything like that. It would just be absolutely impossible to try and prevent movement through those means. So what we rely on is people knowing the things that they can and can't move and knowing the permits that they need to have in place. So that's going to be quite a challenging part of the response, is everybody to know what they need to do. So as I mentioned, our focus is on controlling movement of susceptible species, not the people. Now, in terms of other farming types and the impact on those other farming types, horticultural products won't be restricted. So all of the orchards that we have around will still be continuing to trade and move their product without restriction unless they have had contact with susceptible species or byproducts. Now, I know that there are a lot of horticultural areas which there are mixed farm types. So there are places that grow kiwi fruit that might also have cattle and sheep. Now, we are working through a process of initiating workshops with industry bodies at the moment to try and determine the best way of maybe segregating these properties so that they can still continue to harvest and trade the horticultural products and reduce the risk of FMD being transmitted. So that's going to be quite a complex thing that we work through, and we don't have all the answers on that just yet. But what we know is that because of the massive economic hit that we will take when we get if we get FMD, horticulture is really going to be the thing that carries this country through. So we can't limit that trade because that is going to be critical to the functioning of our country. Now, it's really important, I think, that all farms throughout New Zealand have really good biosecurity practices on farm and up-to-date biosecurity plans. There's really good information on Dairy New Zealand and Beef and Lamb New Zealand websites, as well as our websites, on how to put those sorts of practices in place. And I guess the key message is don't feed uncooked swill to pigs, regardless of if it's a one backyard pig or a commercial operation. So if it does get into the farms, so while the National Livestock Standstill is in place over the entire country, those susceptible species on mixed-use farms won't be able to move for at least 4 weeks, but there will be a permitting system if animals need to return to dairy farms for calving and things like that. It will cause problems regarding availability of feed, or if those animals need to be away from the horticultural operation. So there will be, we'll be working closely with groups in those individual areas and with individual farmers to determine the best solution for those particular properties, recognising that there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So I guess when you're talking to people out there, it's really important to start getting people thinking what measures would need to be put in place to manage risks of cross-contamination and spread on those individual properties, particularly those mixed-use properties. So I'm sort of advocating that everybody get out there and start spreading that message of people taking individual responsibility for biosecurity on their own properties will make life easier in this sort of outbreak, or indeed any other sort of outbreak. So biosecurity really does start with the individual. So that's the end of that presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and open to any questions you might have.
Thank you for that, Catherine.
Oh, and I can see you all again.
It's very informative. Is there any questions or comments for Catherine? Councillor Buckthorpe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was a really good presentation. Thank you, Catherine. I have 2 questions. One is, do people that come in from countries where foot and mouth is prevalent, do they have extra biosecurity at the airport and ports, etc.? And the other question was, did they ever determine how Mycoplasma bovis actually entered the country?
Okay, two good questions. I'll address the first one first. We do have risk profiles at our border on both people and also imports that come in. So some things are subject to increased inspection or other measures. And at the moment, anybody coming from Indonesia who has potentially been in contact with susceptible animals is required to go through a foot bath in order to clean that footwear. So we will from time to time put blanket measures like that if we consider that the risk is great enough. But our biosecurity staff do quite a significant amount of risk targeted profiling of people and imported goods, particularly from those countries where FMD is endemic. As to your second question, the origin of Mycoplasma bovis, we don't know that. And actually that goes for just about any biosecurity incursion. I can only think of one, probably 2 incursions that we've had in my time, and I've been here 12 years, where we absolutely know where the incursion came from. One of those was velvet leaf, which was about 2016, I think, where we tracked that weed species to fodder beet seeds, and it was a contamination of fodder beet seeds, so we know exactly where that came from. And the other one was myrtle rust, and actually this is less sure, but we're pretty certain it blew across from Australia. But almost every single other incursion we've had, we've got some best guesses as to where it might have come from, but we really can't say for sure. So that's the same for Mycoplasma bovis.
Councillor Ngātaki.
I just really wanted to ask if we'd be able to get a copy of the presentation, since Mayor Jackie had requested, so that we can share that with you.
Absolutely, and I've sent that on, so that will be available to everybody.
Any other questions or for Catherine? Catherine, I've just got one myself. With the vaccination, at what point would that be triggered? Would it be if foot and mouth entered Australia? Because I mean, you'd want to vaccinate before it got here, I'd presume. And with where they're stored offshore, how long would it take to have those vaccinations arrive in the country?
So that's two different questions. I'll answer the second one first. So they're stored, the antigens are stored in a bank offshore. So as soon as we need them, we trigger that company to start manufacturing the vaccines. And that whole period of manufacturing and shipment to New Zealand takes 2 weeks. So we can have them here very quickly. In terms of that decision to vaccinate, as soon as we vaccinate animals, we lose our FMD-free status. So we likely would not vaccinate if Australia had FMD. We would massively increase our border measures to try and keep it out of the country. So the decision to vaccinate is something that we can't take lightly, because if we lose our FMD-free status, that does lose a lot of value from our exported products almost overnight. So it's something that we wouldn't want to do, and we would likely only do if we had the virus here in the country and it was looking like it was so widespread that we couldn't manage it through our stamping it out, which is the tracing of infected animals and the culling and disposal and disinfection of those infected animals. If it looks like it's getting away from us, that's likely when that decision to vaccinate would be made. We're currently reviewing our policy settings on that so that we can provide really good advice to the controller when that, if that does happen.
Thank you. Julian?
Hi, Catherine. So I suppose one thing from myself, it was the question from Mayor Jackie when she asked about this last time was, she asked me how confident I was as the Group Controller for Civil Defence in the readiness and preparedness of MPI to be able to stand up a response to implement, if you want, all those response strategies that you've just talked about. Clearly, I can't talk to that. So would you have any assessment on MPI's level of readiness to be able to step up and operationally implement these strategies?
Sure. I think we're more ready now than we ever have been, given the intensive effort we've put in over the last 6 months. So we have done everything from reviewing all of our plans and making sure all of our operational plans are fit for purpose, our domestic relationships. But what we have also done is started working on our people capability. So we have identified a really comprehensive response structure. We have identified all the positions that we will need, both in the National Coordination Centre and out in the regions. These are several thousand positions that we've identified. There are job cards for each one of these positions. All the key positions now have named individuals in those, so we know exactly who will be stepping into those seats if we need it. And that's a program of work, obviously, that we will need to review regularly, because people do shift around and come and go from the organisation. So we are reasonably confident that if we were to get this notification, we would be able to hit the ground running.
Thank you, Catherine. Any other questions? There being none, I'd like to move an amended recommendation, and that one, that the report Ministry for Primary Industries presentation be received, and 2, that Dr. Catherine Duthie of Biosecurity New Zealand be thanked for her presentation. Can I have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Downard and Councillor Ngātaki. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah. Thank you. And if anybody has any further questions, please feel free to email me.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I presume Jess or William, Jill, that the presentation can be forwarded to the Joint Committee. Thank you very much. Right, now I need to move a motion into a public excluded session, and that is for reasons covered under the Lagoima Act 1987, Section 7, Part 2. Can I have Councillor Brown and Councillor Grant, all those in favour? Against? Carried. Right, we'll just pause, make sure we're offline.